Hello everyone and welcome to the Ideas of the Novel PowerPoint for Ms. Montgomery's English 112. This presentation is to help you contextualize some of what you've read thus far in The Shining and to help you think about the essay that you have the rough draft due for next week. I'm sure you've always known the term novel and that this format of work has been familiar to you. It's a long work of prose fiction. It's probably the form of fiction you're most familiar with. If you think even in the grocery store, you walk in and there are novels. You might have also heard other terms like epic and saga that originally refer to poems, but that now we tend to use casually to refer to long narratives. You've also probably heard people use the term novel colloquially. A long email or even a long text message these days, someone might say, "Stop writing that novel." Academic definitions get into the history of the novel. If you look at this definition, I certainly will not read it at you, but you see some highlights. Again, the idea is that a novel is long and that it is prose. It's a relatively new form, as we'll talk about here in a moment, because relatively cheap printing and relatively widespread literacy are necessary for something like the novel to exist. So an allegory like Pilgrim's Progress will directly teach a lesson, or a romance will focus on large events and sweeping emotion. But what we know as the modern novel starts to emerge in about the 16th century. In England, you have Elizabethan prose fiction, you have the French heroic romance, and then certain elements of Spanish poetry. Picaresque means a tale of adventure. Don Quixote, as is mentioned here, is one you may have heard of, and that's where we get the word quixotic, going after unrealistic, crazy goals. Here is that word novel. You may have heard the word novel used as an adjective in other concepts, like that's a novel idea, or that's a novel invention. And if you think of words like nueva in Spanish, or nova, the Italian prefix, it all means new. And the novel, again, is a new form, relatively speaking. Look at the middle of this paragraph. The idea is a human character in a social situation, and a realistic, developed character. Think of Odysseus or Beowulf or King Arthur or other classic characters in those kinds of adventure stories. They don't have a lot of interiority. They're not necessarily very well-developed people. Characters in novels are. If you look at these three bullets, a novel should have a unified plot structure, should have believable characters, and that pervasive illusion of reality. You should be able to practice what's called suspension of disbelief, enter into the imaginative world of the story and not be pulled out of it. And that's not to say that science fiction and fantasy and other kinds of stories like that can't be novels or can't be realistic, as long as they are internally consistent, as long as they follow the rules that they've set up. M.H. Abrams identified several major types of novels. I'll talk through a few of the highlights. The novella is essentially a short novel. It's more of just a publishing and marketing term these days. A novel of incident is something like a genre mystery that is really driven by events. And then a novel of character is quite the opposite, something very driven by interiority. Epistolary novels, you might know the word epistle, are told in the form of letters or diaries. Novels of manners, essentially that's Jane Austen. Stories that are about marriage, are about courtship, are about inheritance, are about social rituals and norms. See these German words in the middle of the list here. If you get into any humanities subjects, you will learn a lot of German words because the modern university as we know it really is the 19th century German university. So the Bildungsroman is the coming of age novel, and the Künstlerroman is specifically coming of age as an artist. Probably the most famous in that format is James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Historical novels take some bygone era as their subject matter. So The Shining is not going to be a historical novel 200 years from now, because it's written about its own era. But if you buy a novel today that's set in the Civil War, that's set in World War II, that is set in medieval England, that looks back to another time and place, that's a historical novel. And what a lot of historical novel authors are doing is trying to answer questions that are left unanswered by the historical record, or trying to provide motives for known events. The regional novel is a novel that, whatever else its plot in is focused on, is really giving you a picture of a particular geographical area, a particular sense of place. William Faulkner, whose short fiction we've read in the course, is really a southern novelist. Stephen King, though this novel you're reading is set mostly in Colorado, is really a New England writer. There's a really large emphasis on his work in creating a portrait of the state of Maine. James Joyce really creates Dublin. Willa Cather really writes about the American West. And I'm sure you could think of other examples. And then magical realism is one of the major interventions of the 19th century, or excuse me, of the 20th century, particularly in Latin American writers. And it is exactly what it sounds like, magic and realism. Side by side, characters are forced to deal with the unexplained and the paranormal, and they approach it as they do other elements of their lives. Take a moment, and you might want to even pause the video and just scribble down some things. Think about novels you have read that might fit into some of these categories. And then if you think about it some more, you'll notice there is a small typo, though you are welcome to think about Pride and Prejudice, because Jane Austen's story is a novel of manners. But think about The Shining. Or think about maybe if you had a book to read your senior year of high school that everyone had to read the same book. What did that look like? Think about your favorite book. Is it a novel of character? Is it a novel of incident? Is it a more psychological story? Think about books you've studied in other courses. Were they more focused on character? Were they more focused on events? Were they more focused on making some kind of social point? And think about what that means for you. And then these last two slides, there are some very broad and very social considerations. Some of this may come into the essays you write, may not, but I'd like to encourage you to think about the kind of social work that we can do by reading, and that the novel as a genre is really open to in ways that perhaps classic epics or poems or other kinds of stories are not. This focus on realistically human characters in social situations encourages us to empathize with the characters in novels whose lives and experiences may be very different from our own. There's a wonderful quote from Abraham Lincoln, you've probably seen it somewhere over the years, about writing being our means of communicating with the absent, the present, the dead, and the unborn. And that sort of cross-cultural, cross-time element is a major part of the experience of reading a novel. And there are authors who will deliberately capitalize on this. One of the most famous 20th century examples is George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm and 1984 directly as a warning about the dangers of communism. And many novelists engage in this. They create a fictional world to think through real-world problems. If you look at Stephen King in The Shining, you have a real horror of alcoholism and family violence paralleled by this paranormal horror. And that's a major element in Stephen King's work. For example, in It, which is another one of his more famous novels, you might have also seen the film. It was made for TV, and it's still on TV every now and again. This demonic clown is murdering children, but then the real horror that is reflected throughout the novel is that a lot of the adults in the novel abuse and neglect the children in their care. So, political advocacy, social problems, alternate visions of society are things that can all be worked out in the novel. And again, I invite you to bring that more broad and philosophical aspect to your reading. Even if it doesn't necessarily get into your essays, I encourage you to make that part of your personal reading experience. So again, think about implications of different novels you've read. Think about your own personal goals and motivations. And do think about other works that you've read. Again, your favorite novel as a child, something you read in high school, something you're reading now. And then you have the citations here. Some of the websites have some interesting links to the history of the novel, and there's a whole wealth of information out there about the history of the book and the history of publishing if you're interested in those things. So I encourage you to think about the novel in creative ways, and I look forward to reading your essays.